Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. On today's show, we are going to talk about Cinco de Mayo. What exactly is Cinco de Mayo? Why do we celebrate it? And what does it mean in the context of US-Mexico relations? That'll be it for today, but I would like to say a very special happy birthday to Peyton Millison, my nephew down there in Edmonds. Happy birthday, Peyton. All right, guys, let's start the show. All right, so first off, I'll just address one thing. Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. I don't actually think that many people believe it is, but it does seem to be a fairly common misconception, right? So Mexican Independence Day is on September 16th. It was September 16th, 1810, that Mexico started their War of Independence against Spain. In Spanish, La Guerra de la Independencia. So that's a good Spanish word for you to remember, perhaps learn today. Guerra, la guerra, means war in Spanish. It's a fun word to say. Guerra, you get that roll. Guerra. It's a good one to know because that is kind of the theme of our program today. I'm going to take you back to this War of Independence in Mexico, and we'll move forward throughout the first half of the 19th century, the 1800s. Just a little explanation of Mexican history here from 1810 until the day in question, Cinco de Mayo, May 5th of 1862. That's 1862 in Spanish. Right, so we get the War of Independence in Mexico from 1810 to 1821. They get their freedom from Spain, but basically they spend the next 30 years or so protecting their borders, protecting their territory, taking on debt. It's not an easy time in Mexico. We still see a strong European influence, those institutions, the Catholic Church, that have a lot of control. There's a very strong central power. Landowners basically own the entire country. But just understand, we really don't see a modern Mexico, the government, until the end of the Mexican Revolution, which goes on between 1910 and 1920-ish. It's a full century after the War of Independence. This is when figures like Pancho Villa, Emilio Zapata, and the president of Mexico at that point, Porfirio Diaz, become widely known. I think most Americans think back on those figures, Pancho Villa, Zapata, again, Porfirio Diaz, as the most famous, most notorious Mexican figures. But this really isn't the case. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, so let's go back. Mexico gains its independence from Spain, 1821. Now, during this period in the United States, we see the rise of this policy called the Monroe Doctrine. This was put in place in the 1820s. President Monroe basically establishes these guidelines that say that European powers cannot reassert themselves in colonies that have gained independence. Because in the early 1800s, we're seeing a lot of countries in Central and South America gain their independence and become republics. So the Monroe Doctrine basically says, stay out of our hemisphere. If you assert yourself here, we will respond. We want to preserve these ideas of liberalism, republics, freedom in the New World. We also want to be able to exploit these countries for ourselves. Eventually, one of the territories in the north of Mexico, what we call Texas, decides they want to be independent. So there's a war fought there in the 1830s. This is where a lot of Texans know the name Santa Anna from. The Texans, this ragtag group of Americans, beats the Mexican government and becomes an independent republic. It's a cute little republic for a few years, but eventually Texas is brought into the United States, brought into the Union. Now, there were plenty of American politicians who were against Texas becoming a part of the Union, mostly because slavery is legal in Texas. And you got to understand there's this political debate going on in America that really dominates our political sphere about slavery. Should new states, new territories be accepted into the Union as slave states versus non-slave states? This eventually leads to the Civil War. But anyway, Texas ends up becoming a part of the United States there in the late 1830s. And it's not long thereafter that President Polk decides that he does not like this idea that the Mexicans have that the border between the United States and Mexico is along the Nueces River. He wants to extend that border down to the Rio Grande, but Mexico's not keen on this idea, right? They've already given up their territory in Texas. Any more incursion might lead to more of their territories in what is now the western United States being annexed. So there's some scuffling, there's some shots fired. Polk sends troops down to what he believes is the real U.S.-Mexico border along the Rio Grande, and it all just escalates from there. But basically, Polk decides that since he's been offering for Mexico to sell us a big chunk of their territory, and they've always refused, that this is a good opportunity to flex our muscle and really make something happen. So we go at it. We invade Mexico from all sides, the north, the west. There's a huge blockade in the Pacific. We eventually march our troops all the way into Mexico City, and our troops get all the way up there to the Castillo de Chapultepec, which is in the center of Mexico City. Here's a picture from a recent visit of mine down there. It's a really beautiful area. There's a large park there by the same name. It's sort of Mexico City's Central Park. Really beautiful area. But this is a very, very important historical landmark in Mexico. The castle here at the top of the hill is a spot that the Mexicans used to train new soldiers. So at this point in the Mexican-American War, it's basically just 14, 15-year-old soldiers in training. Our troops storm the castle and are engaged in battle with these young cadets. They refuse to surrender. Many of them throw themselves off the side of the castle and kill themselves rather than to be captured by the Americans. These kids are icons, they're heroes. When I went up to Chapultepec, there was this amazing mural. Amazing murals pretty much everywhere, but this iconography of these kids protecting the country of Mexico and the center of Mexican culture against the Americans is very prominent. You have to understand this event still has left a big scar on the Mexican psyche. When they think about their relations with Americans, there's often calls back to this moment. It's sort of a moment for them like Pearl Harbor or when the French invaded and burnt Washington, D.C. to the ground. Not something they'll ever forget, likely. But what ends up happening here is the Mexican government decides that it's just futile to continue fighting against the Americans. Polk gets what he wants. Mexico cedes a third of their territory to us, what is now New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, all of California, a big chunk of Colorado. So that all becomes a part of the United States, along with Texas, all the way south to the Rio Grande. Of course, there's a lot of political opposition against the Mexican-American War here. A lot of people see it as a new American imperialism, a counter to what we stand for, our liberal values, our republic, this new school way of governing. So yeah, there you have it. At the end of the Mexican-American War, Mexico is left in pretty rough shape. They're in debt. They've had to borrow a bunch of money from other countries, European countries, in order to fight this war. So they're trying to recover. Now they move forward. A decade later, in the 1850s, we see La Guerra de Reforma. This is a reform war. This is basically a Mexican civil war that is fought between liberals and conservatives. Again, ignore our modern concepts of liberal and conservative. The liberals here are people who believe in liberty, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom of religion, all of the institutions that we see coming about in the United States. And for that reason, the United States in the 1850s backs the liberals in this war. The liberals, of course, are led by Benito Juarez, who we should all know of. Benito Juarez is the most famous Mexican political figure. You could think of Benito Juarez as Abraham Lincoln, perhaps, someone that we hold up as the greatest American president, the greatest American leader. But the United States backs Juarez and the liberals, but they still have to take on a good amount of debt in fighting this war. It's a very drawn-out, long civil war. The conservatives and the liberals both take on even more debt from European powers. Benito Juarez finally takes control of the government. So things are starting to look up. Of course, Mexico is broke. So the liberals put in place this 2-year freeze on paying back foreign debt, which really angers the Spanish, the British, and especially the French. So as we move into the 1860s, there's this tension there. So in 1861, the British, the Spanish, and the French sail into Veracruz, Mexico, demanding payment. Of course, the Spanish and the British don't realize that the French have every intention of invading Mexico. But you might ask, hold on now, what about the Monroe Doctrine? Where are the Americans in all this? Well, it's 1861. So as the French are setting up, getting ready to invade Mexico, the U.S. is fighting a civil war, right? We have the Confederate States of America. We have a battle going on in the United States for preservation of that republic, a battle going on over the question of slavery. And the French seized this opportunity to assert themselves in the Western Hemisphere, specifically here in Mexico. The U.S., of course, doesn't like this, but there's not much we can do. We have to use our resources to fight the Civil War. So the French camp out, they stay for a while, they decide to invade, and a battle is fought in Puebla, Mexico, on the 5th of May in 1862. Now, the French far outnumbered the Mexican troops. The Mexican army was decimated from years of war, but somehow the Mexicans are able to beat the French at the first Battle of Puebla there in 1862, Cinco de Mayo. It's a big celebration because it's quite an upset. The Mexican psyche is battered, it's beaten down. So a victory like this is really, really inspirational. But the French retreat, they bring in more troops, they'll fight a second Battle of Puebla and beat the Mexicans and take over the country. What they do is they install a monarch, a new monarch, an Austrian chap named Maximilian. He becomes the ruler of Mexico, a de facto ruler for the French until 1867, when, after the Civil War in America ends, resources can be put to help Benito Juarez and the liberals take back their country. They push the French out, they assassinate Maximilian, and they finally get their country back. So there you have it. Cinco de Mayo is a celebration of a single battle in Puebla, Mexico, a single glimmer of hope that stands out in a very tumultuous time in Mexican history. So while I'm not really sure that many Americans understand what exactly it is that Cinco de Mayo commemorates, it quickly becomes known as this celebration of Mexican-American heritage. We started celebrating it in California in the 1860s, and it's become much like St. Patrick's Day, not so much a celebration in its original form, but more of a way to celebrate certain cultural aspects of our own country. And of course, a great excuse to drink lots of alcohol. But there you have it, folks. So that's Cinco de Mayo for you. The second French intervention. This is one of my favorite periods of Mexican history. I love this larger dynamic that we see here during the American Civil War, where you see French powers, monarchs trying to reassert themselves in the New World and the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately failing. So that's it for today's show, folks. I hope you enjoyed that little history lesson. Please enjoy Cinco de Mayo responsibly. Remember, it's the anniversary of the Mexican victory over France at the Battle of Puebla in 1862. But also remember that during the Mexican-American War, we were pretty much complete dicks to our neighbors to the south. So when you're drunkenly rolling around with a sombrero on tonight and people are rolling their eyes at you, it's not just because you're acting like a buffoon, but it's perhaps because you don't realize what memories that kind of behavior invokes in the Mexican psyche. All right? So stay safe, stay sane, and we will see you tomorrow.